Admit. Yep. Interesting.
Who's giving free helicopter?
Velasquez?
Yeah. Somebody's giving free helicopter.
It is Anthony Velasquez.
Not that I would ever get in a helicopter. Where the helicopters flew? Everyone can fly away. Soma, we need a bigger room.
For real.
Nobody's going to show up. Soma, you just don't understand the dynamism of all of this. And there's the cult of Steinberg.
You got it.
I also had my husband pass out some of the flyers at 160th.
So the fire code for the room is 110. So I think so far we're good. 110 is the fire code.
I know, but for the midst of a viral pandemic.
Dr. Banerjee.
So hold on to your chair.
Dr. Banerjee, is the other room being used?
Let me check.
Here you go. I'm not sure. Anyone sit in my chair?
Oh my goodness. Dr. Steinberg, this is your spot.
And then that's the microphone. And you got Dr. Gregg. Do you have her PowerPoint?
He says there's two on there, so Dr. Banerjee did set up the PowerPoints.
Stuff up in a hurry.
Yeah, for real, huh? There's a chair right there, just pull it over. I'm right there where the computer is.
I'm official today.
You're official today. Was there a shotgun in the
With her, most likely, yeah.
Well, not bad. All right, there's a quick update because there's a lot of people in the room. We're going to open the partition. So we'll start the talk in about 5 to 6 minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yeah, we need to spread out.
Well done.
In the midst of the virus.
Right.
You know, facility.
Yeah, so pretty sure. I went to the, like, they did it. Is this like 5 seconds?
Especially since
See, I told you.
You're going in first, John. You haven't.
Shannon and I agreed on that.
Okay.
Gotta come this way or else.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well. All right. Well, thank you for coming. Hey, thank you for coming, everybody. We will begin this presentation, this event. My name is Dr. Somak Banerjee. I'm an associate professor in history and philosophy in the College of Arts and Letters. We are part of a couple of great school student clubs on campus. We are Phi Alpha Theta, History Club, India Club, and Phi Sigma Alpha. So if you want to be members of these clubs, please do reach out to me or the other political science professors or student club advisors here. So we have two things of order before we start the talk. The first is there is an attendance sheet. There is an attendance sheet here on this table. Please write your name, your A number, and your email before leaving this presentation. So please write your name, your email, and your A number on this attendance sheet. That's how we track the number of people. We have to keep a tab on the people who attended the talk. So please do write your name before you leave with the attendance sheet. And the second thing is about food. We have some sandwiches, avocado sandwich and chicken sandwich, which is here. Again, there's a couple of boxes here. It's free for everybody who is attending this event. So if you want, please do grab a box, and there's a bottle of water, which you can grab before you leave. We don't want to waste food.
So it'll be great if you have in the next 1 minute or 2 minutes, come and grab a box of sandwich and a bottle of water. So having said that, we will start our presentation today. We have the honor of having two very distinguished speakers today. Professor John Steinberg and Professor Anna Gregg from political science. Professor John Steinberg is from history and philosophy, and they will enlighten us about the current confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. So thank you for coming. Over to Dr. Steinberg.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. What Dr. Banerjee didn't tell you is I'm taking that list of names there and enrolling all of you in Russian history, because you need to take Russian history to understand what's going on here today. And nothing points that out better than the idiotic statement that Vladimir Putin, that's what the French call it, they call it Putin, made yesterday, where he said Ukraine was an invention of the Bolsheviks. Actually, Ukraine was an important turning point for the Bolsheviks. It was not an invention of the Bolsheviks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to contextualize Ukraine into the greater scheme of world history. And then I'm going to hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Gregg, to talk about current events. And then we will turn it open for discussion, questions, and so forth. So if I can find my, here we go. We go there and we go here. I'm calling my talk today, The Project. From the beginning. The project, you like that? What was the project? Well, to understand, we begin by saying, once upon a time, there was a state called Muscovy. Okay, and no kidding, this goes back to the 16th century. They had this czar. He called himself a czar. You know him as Ivan the Terrible. The Russians called him Ivan the Awe-inspiring, which is far more fitting for what he did and who he was. What he did was he defeated the Golden Horde, which was the last vestiges of the Mongol Empire. And then he spent the rest of his reign, and it was a long reign. He ruled from the 1530s, 1538 to be precise, for who's asking, to 1584. He spent the rest of his reign taking on this crowd here, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and also the Swedes. Okay, what are you doing?
I'm changing your share. It's not showing on the.
You're
What?
changing my what?
There's a technical.
Oh, okay. I know what's going on here.
They want to see.
Yeah, all right, hold on.
It's.
Yeah. There we go. Well, that's even better, isn't it? Okay. Now who can share only, all right, okay. So now I can just do this. Now, how do I advance? Okay, try this. There we go. This was the project, ladies and gentlemen. You see it? That was the Russian Empire at its height. And the Russians spent from the 16th century until the beginning of the 20th century, when they pushed all the way out here to the Far East, where they got a bloody nose from these guys over here. It's called the Japanese. Okay, and that kind of put an end to the imperial project. A revolution got in the way, and things fell and things rose and so forth, and we'll get there. But what I want to do now is focus on contested borderlands. And now things are going to come into focus for you. Ukraine, as you go into the 16th, 17th century, was a contested borderland between this rising Muscovite power, Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And there's another power down here. Anybody know what this power is down here? The Ottomans. Okay, so Ukraine is where these guys are duking it out, so to speak. Now, when you look at the map, how many of you have ever thought about Poland being a superpower? One person, two people. What happened to Polish power? Oh, it's the fate of all great empires. A self-serving minority comes to power. They're only interested in themselves, and eventually they lose their state. This whole state is going to disappear from the map of Europe at the end of the 18th century. And its disappearance begins in conflict over the Ukraine. Okay, so now let's just take a brief moment to look at the this. Here's the Ottomans, and I can't reach it. An Austin P pointer. Is there a laser in this? Maybe. Does it work? Niet. Huh? Okay. Austin P pointer.
Yeah, it works, it works.
You got it to work? Which button am I pushing? Uh-huh. So the Ottomans, there we go. Look at that. You guys recognize that? What's that? Crimea. See if it's off? The Ottomans have control of this, and they are pushing into Ukraine. So now I know you're dying to know. Who lives in Ukraine during this period? 16th, 17th, 18th century. You know, sometimes I learn really important things from students. It happens. Okay. Cossacks. This is a famous painting in Russian history. You go to the State Art Museum, the Russian State Art Museum in St. Petersburg, and this is kind of small compared to the painting itself. And the tour guides love to put you in front of it to say, these are the Cossacks. This is one of the tribes, if you will. There's 11 different Cossack hosts that wander the steppe, if you will. Now, who are these guys? Well, they're a combination of people, of different ethnic groups. A lot of them come off of, as I said, the Central Asian steppe, the same place the Ottomans came from, the same place the Mughals came from. And they have migrated into Ukraine because what do they want? What do you think these guys want? I think above everything else, they want to be left alone to live their lives as they want to live them. Now, what they're doing here is they've hired a scribe because at the end of one of the wars between the Russians and the Ottomans, the Russians win. This is the war that was fought by Peter the Great's father. Okay. Peter the Great's father, Alexis, beats up on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, signs a treaty with the Cossacks, and the Ottomans then come forth, and the Sultan says, you don't want to align yourself with the Tsar. You want to come to me. Well, this is the response. They're blowing off the Sultan. Okay, and the whole reason why, can you imagine why the Cossacks choose the Russians over the Turks and over the Poles? Come on, they offer them a better deal. Isn't that why you choose what you choose? It's not complicated. The Russians provide the Cossacks of the Ukraine and to points eastward the right to establish their own self-government, the right to control their own territory. This was a big deal because in addition to these steppe people, you will find ethnic Russians in the Cossacks. And these are runaway slaves, or serfs, as the Russians would call them. These are the people who in the 17th century, as the Romanovs are consolidating their power and usurping their own people, who say they're not going to take it. So, I mean, these are pretty rowdy people, is what I would call them. They want to live life on their own. They don't want the state to interfere with them. And what they enter into is this deal with the Russians, where they have these unusual freedoms for non-noble people. In return for what evolves into, they become the czars, kind of like special forces. Okay, they're the go-to guys when, you know, dirty work needs to be done. All right, in 1676, they agree to become a part of the Russian Empire. And this starts the process of, and now we're getting to a map that might even be apropos for what we're looking at today. Why am I not moving? What'd you do here, Sona? There. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Ukraine. Okay, so the Russians enter into agreements with these Cossacks that are living here and down here. And they begin this process, as I say up here, of expansion and Russification into Ukraine. Okay, by Russification, what are we talking about? This is a neat word that fits into the rubric of imperialism and colonialism. It's we're coming in and we're taking over, we're occupying, which incidentally is what has happened in the eastern districts of Ukraine in the last 48 hours. We're going to impose our rule of law. We're going to bring our bureaucrats in. And oh, by the way, we're going to set up educational institutions that teach you to be good Russian Orthodox, Russian-speaking people. Okay. And they try to push their way eastward. Now, I don't know, these maps, you find them online. Usually you talk about the Dnieper River being the dividing point. They talk about East Bank versus West Bank. The further east you go, the more Russified it is. The further west you go, well, then there's this question of who's actually there. Okay, and who are these Ukrainians? And actually, folks, Ukrainians go back as old as Russian history. Here we could step into it and start talking about the 9th and 10th century, when a Russian state first emerges around the city of Kiev. Yeah. But this distinction remains to this day. That is East Bank versus West Bank, or Eastern Ukraine versus Western Ukraine. In the 19th century, Western Ukraine undergoes a revival, if you will. So now we're doing it down here. 19th century, this is happening across Europe. It's one of the byproducts of the French Revolution. It's a reaction to the Enlightenment. It is the age of Romanticism. And no, I'm not talking about people being engaged for 15 years and then finally getting married. My God, what happened? Okay. I am talking about this notion of falling in love with your own national identity. And so I'm just putting up a picture here of Shevchenko as a representative of this movement, which spreads across Europe. The further east you go, the more radical they become. You know that joke? The further east you go, the more radical people become and the dirtier the toilets get. You ever heard that one? It's true. Shevchenko is the individual who steps forward and says, we are Ukrainians. He teaches people to think like Ukrainians and to think in Ukrainian. And this is a direct affront to the Russian Empire. It is a challenge to it. And it's kind of simmering there. I'd say, look at the dates of Shevchenko's life. Mid-century, he starts to gain traction. Famously, most of his stuff is never published in Ukraine because he's censored. But he's kind of like a Renaissance man. And he's just a representative of this broad 19th century romantic movement. I mean, if you go to Poland, there's Adam Mickiewicz, who teaches Poles to think like Poles and to write in Polish. For the Czechs, it's Ferenc Diak. Everybody has every one of these groups who's a part of either the Russian Empire at this point or the Austrian Empire. They're all trying to gain, what we call in the 20th century, national self-determination. And the moment for national self-determination, it's a high point right here. And two people entered the waiting room. Can you let them in? Technology. Okay. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, if you've taken my courses, you've heard this. Okay, this is the first peace treaty of World War I. The first treaty that tries to end combat. And in fact, there are two treaties. The first one is with the Ukrainians. It's between the Ukrainians and the Central Powers. It's known in history as the Bread Treaty. And for the first time, Ukraine is recognized as an autonomous nation. Okay, and in return, the Central Powers, and if you know your World War I history, 1917, 1918, they're starving. What they're after are the grain surpluses coming out of Ukraine, because the Ukraine at that point was the breadbasket of Central Europe. So they make this trade-off. It infuriates everybody around them, especially the Bolsheviks. But the Bolsheviks, who came to power in October of 1917, so October to March, one of the ways they came to power was they destroyed the integrity of the old imperial army. They had no army to confront the Germans with. And the Germans kept saying, we're going to annex more and more territory as the Bolsheviks held out. And so finally, it's an important moment in Russian history, because this is where Lenin really consolidates his power. There's all sorts of opposition to signing a treaty where you lose all these Western borderlands. And Lenin says, we have to do it. If we don't do it, the German army is going to end our revolution. And then there's all sorts of things like, we just need a breathing space, a period of time, because ultimately the Germans are going to lose the war. He was right, wasn't he? But they signed this treaty. And look at what happens to Ukraine. Ukraine, that had gotten its independence in February, in March, after the signing of this treaty, immediately, the people who signed that treaty with the Central Powers in February, they immediately begged the Germans, Austrians, but it's the German army, to occupy Ukraine, because the Bolsheviks are trying to take over. Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, who says all along he believes in national self-determination, learns over Ukraine that, well, national self-determination, the right of people to govern themselves, it's kind of slippery. And we want people to govern themselves right up until we want the resources of the territory. And if nothing else, Ukraine is resource rich to this day. Okay. And so the Bolsheviks, I mean, much of the Civil War in the South, and the Civil War is a very complex war. And I'm talking about the Russian Civil War, not this incident that happened here. Okay, it's a very complex war. There's a Southern Front. It happens in Ukraine. Between 1918 and 1921, there's something like 10 governments that rule Ukraine. The chaos, the violence, the politically inspired violence through this area is actually a harbinger of what's going to happen during World War II. And the only reason why I don't worry about another outbreak of ethnic violence right now is because all the ethnic groups were murdered by the Nazis. And if you want to believe Vladimir Putin, by the Ukrainians. That's a whole nother story altogether. And it's not a pretty one. Of course, then again, yesterday I read in the New York Times how there's a community of Jews in Odessa, which is on the Black Sea, who are prepared to evacuate. They've hired the Israelis to help them evacuate in case there is an all-out invasion. And these are people whose families survived the Holocaust and came back to Ukraine. Okay, well, as history plays out, the Germans lose World War I. November of 1918, this treaty is abrogated. Civil war, violence, all sorts of ugly stuff occurs. And we like to say in 1921, with the signing of something called the Treaty of Riga, which ends a conflict between the Poles and the Soviets. One where first the Poles fight the Ukrainians, then the Ukrainians and the Poles join forces to defeat the Red Army. We like to say the violence ended then, but I don't think so. I think that there is, the word that the sources like to go back to is banditry. Just a lot of peasant unrest over who's going to control the land. But the real point I want to make about this slide, this is what the borderland looked like as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Okay? When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation emerged, there's the border. And if you can just kind of, it's hard because here's Crimea here, and here's Crimea there. The border isn't identical, but it's very similar. Now, if you'd been a Soviet citizen growing up in the Soviet Union in the post-World War II period, there's a whole body of literature on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is, the way it's interpreted is, it was an event by the imperialists designed to strip Russia of its natural territory that is integral to its integrity, territory that is in its zone of influence. Okay, it's a huge black mark on our history that we ever signed this treaty. Right, this is their interpretation of it. And then in 1991, the border is right back there. And now think about the title of this talk, the project. Okay, Ukraine is a borderland that has always been integral to the imperial project. And think about Vladimir Putin, as the French call him. I'm stuck on that, I'm sorry. I'll get over it eventually. Okay, but who is Putin? And I know Dr. Gregg's going to talk more about this, but he's an old KGB operative. Okay, the Soviet Union, he considers the collapse of that to be the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of his lifetime. And for him, it is. Okay, and so then I go to, where am I now? Help me here. Here we go. No. Why won't I advance? So. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So here, I'd like to say I put this together last week, but here in these provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, that have been occupied now. And I just love the way Putin operates. I don't love him, don't misunderstand me, but coming up with, he has sent troops in on a peacekeeping mission. That's taking the dagger and turning it on the capitalists. Isn't this what you do? Isn't this what you always say? Isn't the UN full of peacekeeping missions? Well, that's all I'm doing here. And then this is showing, and again, this was last week. Well, this is January, actually. I think it's very interesting. Last week, if you read in the sources, oh, there was 100,000 troops surrounding Ukraine. Today, that number is 190,000 troops. They are getting ready to go, perhaps. But on the other hand, what I have to tell you is the longer Putin drags this out, the better it works for him. Just look at the price of a barrel of oil. Think about it when you gas up. Okay. For the Russians, the higher that barrel of oil is, the more solvent their economy is. And so what I want to do is, I got one more slide here and then I'm going to turn it over. What the hell's going on here? Why is your finger better than mine? Thanks. In 2014, I gave a talk to, I don't know if it's the Lions or the Kiwanis, I don't know who they were. Some people invited me, they offered me a free lunch and I talked to them. I gave them a talk entitled, "The Russians Are Coming and They Are Not Going Away." So this was right after the whole Crimean thing happened in 2014. Okay. I personally see this in its historical context as Putin and his supporters, they're not going to stop till they put together the old Soviet Union. And I don't think they're necessarily going to stop there. The thing that got me in trouble in 2014, ladies and gentlemen, is I said, you know, what set them off was the expansion of NATO right up to the frontier of Russia. Okay? The expansion of NATO, ladies and gentlemen, is something akin in his mind to if he were to form an alliance, say, with the Mexicans. How would you react? What would you think? If a defensive alliance, quote unquote, loyal, where the focus, where the finance behind it comes out of Moscow, started reaching out right up to our borders. Could you imagine that? Now, the way things are going up in Canada now, I think they might have a better shot getting the Canadians to go along with it. It seems really far-fetched, doesn't it? I like to say when I was your age, it seemed really far-fetched that the Soviet Union would disintegrate. Just like you think it's really far-fetched the United States could disintegrate. Am I right? Well, if you've been a Soviet citizen in the 70s, and Dr. Gregg could probably speak more to this than I can. You'd never imagine the world without the Soviet Union. I didn't as a student of the Soviet Union. So things can change. Putin has a dream. He has a plan. This is just the beginning. And I will turn it over to Dr. Gregg at this point. Yes. Put that in your finger.
So as we do the changeover, there is an attendance sheet here. I'll again remind you, please do write your name, your A number, your email, and there's a couple of sandwich boxes here. So please come and help yourself and a bottle of water in the couple of minutes we have in the changeover. Everybody.
It's on top here, slideshow. Yep, and from the beginning.
Wait a minute, and then people are just writing their names.
Does the,
So
This
you can
works?
use it here.
okay. I'm not used to this, but I usually do this
Okay,
one.
you can use this too. Just come take this. and if
I
it's
guess
connected,
not, I guess not.
Somehow.
That's okay, I can do this.
Yeah. So you just let me know, I can change it. So you just, put it in and just.
I guess that was my Steinberg fix for the semester.
There is this if you want. There's a laser pointer here.
Yeah, and I didn't make you
Thank you.
Let's get together sometime.
Okay, let's continue. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Gregg, and you hear my accent. I born and made in Soviet Union, and I'm a perestroika girl. I'm not Putin's girl. That's if you're wondering here. My loyalties is what is how to say it. I'm an American citizen now, so my values are with you. But I'm not. I didn't come here to participate in a Russian fashion party. I actually wanted to tell you the other side of the story, so I'm going to be playing here for the most part the devil's advocate and tell the story from the Russian perspective, more or less. So I wanted to start with the same: judge tenderly if you must. There is usually a side you have not heard, a story you know nothing about, and a battle waged that you are not having to fight. So I think it kind of spoke to me. And one of the differences is between historians and history is the older, political science is a baby compared to history. So I'm a political science professor, not a history professor. But the main difference is that political scientists, they have a theory for every single occasion. Versus historians, the time moves only one way direction. Kind of thing. So I wanted to start with the, okay. So different levels of analysis and different theories out there. So international system level of analysis. And here we have balance of power theory. And so it essentially says that the powerful country that we call the great powers, they usually come in pairs, and they usually kind of look at each other, stare at each other, trying to stare each other down. Sometimes they go to war, sometimes they just trying to take over certain parts of the world. So balance of power theory, we'll talk about the expansion of NATO, which Dr. Steinberg already mentioned. Then there is a geopolitical theory, and it's a curse of the buffer states. That's how I titled my presentation, because the buffer states are the states usually geographically located between two great powers. And in this particular case, it's not United States and Russia, it's NATO countries and Russian Federation. So, and buffer states are usually caught in between, and the best thing they can do is to proclaim their neutrality. We're neutral, we're not with this or that. And if they violate that neutrality, balance of power goes off the kilter. And essentially that upsets one side or the other side. Okay, now international system on level of analysis is one kind of thing. Now the national level of analysis. So identity politics, you already heard from Dr. Steinberg, the national identity is a very persuasive idea. Imagine community, how Benedict Anderson called it, meaning that the nation and this idea that you belong to something bigger than yourself, that's something that is not dying, it's your immortality project, if you will. So it's a very powerful idea. It makes people die for their nation, go into the war, go without. So, and with Russians and as well as with the Ukrainians and American people as well, it's kind of powerful idea, but it's not always there. In a crisis situation, it usually kind of comes together and people feel strongly. They call it rally around the flag syndrome, that after September 11th, that's what was happening in the United States. And those national identities, they are shared, those are shared perceptions, some historical myths that people strongly believe in. And mass media actually put an interesting twist into this formation of the national identity and idea of historical, what actually happened. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the whole course could be taught on each of these topics. Okay. So, and finally, individual level of analysis, personality politics, political psychology. Who are the people who are making decisions? Who is Vladimir Putin? Who is Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and how they interact with each other? How do they looking over their shoulders and thinking, what is President Trump doing, or what is President Biden thinking? Those kind of things. And those are not separate. We only lay them out in this kind of separate levels just for the purposes of analysis. Because the way in the real world works, it's all those forces at play at the same time. And so Vladimir Putin growing up, and his father was the hero of the World War II, came from the front, essentially raised patriotic son. Later on, that son grew up, went to be hired by the KGB. He strongly believed in ideas. Then all of a sudden, this loyal country that he felt so strongly about, all of a sudden it disintegrated without a fight, without anybody even picking up the arms. So it's really affected Putin in that regard. So leadership style of decision makers certainly has an imprint, but I want you to understand that all three levels of analysis, they're at play, kind of they interplay with each other, and sometimes one factor makes a difference, the other factor makes a difference. That's why we call the social science is a soft science. There's no it's not deterministic. There is no 100% probability of anything happening. It's always probabilistic. The likelihood of something happen over the other. One factor plays, overpowers the other. So let's talk a little bit about the balance of power theory and NATO's expansion after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union broke up in 1991. Essentially, the nuclear codes were passed on from Mikhail Gorbachev to Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia. But in place of the Soviet Empire, now there were three nuclear, or actually four nuclear power states. Anybody knows who they were? Well, Russia was one. Yeah, go ahead. Ukraine was one of them, Belarus was the third one, and Kazakhstan was the fourth one. And in 1994, there was a treaty signed that when Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, they surrendered their nuclear capabilities with the promise of security on the part of the United States was a part of that. Russia was the part of that, and the European Union was there as well. So, and now Russia is essentially violating, there were so many accusations, there were a piece on NPR this morning that I was listening to, driving to work, that it's actually that after all the promises that Ukraine is untouchable, because nuclear state, they are untouchable. Nobody wants to start the nuclear exchange. And so if you think about it, yet another political science minor theory is that the best thing a country can do to make itself untouchable is to become a nuclear power state. Look at Iran, those kind of things. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so actually, even before the Soviet Union broke apart, 1990, reunification of Germany, East Germany becomes a part of NATO as well as Western Germany, which was one of the founding states of NATO. 1999, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Going back to the buffer states. Soviet Union actually had not the buffer states, but buffer zone, which is called Eastern Europe. Now this buffer zone, the former members of this buffer zone starting to join the NATO, which actually NATO, remember balance of power theory? There's always two sides of the story. So NATO's on one side, Warsaw Pact on the other side. Warsaw Pact disappears with the breakup of the Soviet Union. NATO remains and becomes stronger. So 2002, 2004, and I highlighted in red former Soviet states that were not just a part of the buffer zones, they were part of the Soviet Union. They were Soviet Socialist republics. There's the names of the Soviet Socialist Republic, including their capitals, I had to memorize as a student of the middle school. We had to know them by heart. So 2017, Montenegro. Anybody knows what Montenegro used to be? Besides Dr. Steinberg. That was part of the former Yugoslavia, socialist country in a buffer zone that broke apart. 2020, North Macedonia. So that's part of the former Yugoslavia as well, which the whole Macedonia was one of the provinces of the Yugoslavia, but now it subdivided there. And the one thing that I'm sure very few of you, if any, knew, in 2021, what set off the current events that we're witnessing, NATO officially recognizes 3 aspiring members: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. So it's, why is it happening now? Is it COVID? Something happened to with the virus that Putin went funny in the head? No, that's what it is. It was a trigger. It was not the major cause, because the causes are much deeper there, but the trigger was right there. So NATO officially recognized 3 aspiring members. Why 3 aspiring members? Why not just go and admit them into NATO? Because they have to meet certain qualifications. So they have to be established democracies. They have to have certain economic stability. They have to dedicate certain part of their national income, yearly income, towards the NATO, essentially rearming NATO, dedicate certain troops to NATO as well. And so meeting qualifications process
began in 2021. And that certainly set off these events that we are seeing. I'm not necessarily saying that Putin was right in his rights to do that. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it didn't happen just because he decided to do so. So geopolitics. One of the things about geopolitics, it never changes. It's kind of like you can get a divorce, but you can never get a separate apartment. You're always going to share the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. So Ukraine is always going to be in the center of Europe. And it's a #2 by territory country in Europe. What's #1? Russia. Russia. It's Eurasia. Yes, they say it's kind of one foot in Asia, 1 foot in Europe, but it's considered to be European country, one of the European powers, and 2/3 of the population of Russia actually live on the European plateau, before the mountains. Very few people live in Siberia. So, and so this is a kind of political cartoon, I just thought. Not to be too serious, but if Putin had his ways, all Europe would be buffer zone. So there is a theory, again, political science theory, and it's kind of old theory during the Cold War, 1983. Options for buffer zone diplomacy or buffer states diplomacy. They have only 3 choices. They can do the multilateral declaration of neutrality. They can remain neutral and say, we're not really getting involved. We're not siding with one or the other. They could lean on one side, which usually leads to partition, because the other superpower that's staring at this buffer state, they're not going to just watch its side with the other side. What they're going to do, they're going to try find sympathizers inside and trying to create some political upheaval inside. The third power option, if there is a knight in a shining armor comes in, and that United States already part of NATO, so that option is not available, but that was option of the World War II. So continuing on that, and Dr. Steinberg already showed the map of linguistic divide in Ukraine, but this is a little bit more recent one, 2012, according to surveys, and I showed the source over there. So Ukrainian language, most of the Ukraine, but Russian language right here, you can see Crimea, you can see Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast. Donetsk, by the way, is a city, it's a capital there in province, Luhansk as well as a city, but we call them Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast. So anyway, you can see, and why is language so important? Because it's a part of the national identity. That's how nation communicates with each other. That's how they know they understand each other. That's how they see eye to eye. So even, for instance, you hear my accent still. My native language is Russian. I'm never going to get rid of that accent, no matter how hard I would try. And so if people before the age of 4 absorb this language, it becomes their native language. They can learn some other languages, pick up them, but it's not going to be their native. They can become proficient, they can become very good at it. So now, after Crimean annexation 2014, obviously, Russia annexed Crimea and made it one of the regions of Russia, gave the separate status to Sevastopol and the rest of Crimean Peninsula. That happened in 2014. At the same time, the the protests started, they grew into the separatist movement in Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast. And the fighting started. That's Russian speaking population essentially were against the government, Ukrainian government in Kyiv, which they still perceived it as illegitimate because the democratically elected president of Ukraine essentially defected into Russia, fearing for his life, and the government, provisional government in Kyiv was never recognized by Russia. And so they're arguing that today's Ukrainian government is not really legitimate. That's their side of the story. Now, those two rogue provinces that essentially define the central government of Ukraine, they tried to declare independence. They actually had a referendum as a Crimea, but Russia signaled them that they do not want to admit them as provinces of Russia. And so their referendum actually was on independence. They wanted to become sovereign independent countries, sovereign independent states. And Putin never recognized it back then. They did try twice to achieve peace in the region. The Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, which is supposedly the third-party country that's supposed to be neutral, and it was signed by representatives of the trilateral contact group, Ukraine on one side, Russia on the other side, and OSCE on the third side, which is the security organization in Europe. And heads of the Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People Republic, which were not recognized at the time. Well, yesterday they were recognized by Putin, but they were part of that neither peace lasted. And to make matters worse, and to kind of say the Ukrainian parliament never recognized those treaties, even though they were signed by Ukrainian side, the president of Ukraine at the time, or the acting president of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian parliament rather turned it down, not recognized. And at the same time, in the middle between those two protocols, what happened, Malaysian airline flight got shot down allegedly by the Russian weapon, which from this rogue province territory by those fighters for independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. So, and finally, the individual level of analysis. Again, political scientists have been wondering what's something about this persona of Putin, which so much negative PR goes from the media about him as an individual, as an authoritarian leader, and so on and so forth. Yet many Americans that I spoke to, at least, I haven't conducted the official survey, but they're fascinated by him. They kind of have distaste for him, but yet some kind of respect there. So I already mentioned his background a little bit, and it defined his values. Now, his training in the security service of the Soviet Union, then the security service of Russian Federation, certainly had an impact on him. And his move, by the way, he gets what he wants. One of the things, what does this move, what he did, recognize sovereignty of Donetsk and Lugansk yesterday, instead of taking them under Russian wing. Then gave the presidential orders to deploy so-called peacekeepers. Those are not peacekeepers by definition of the United Nations. Why not? Because there is no peace to keep. There is no peace to keep. There is fighting going on. Those are the Russian troops that moved in with the invitation from those unrecognized governments in Donetsk and Luhansk. So like we talked about the buffer state theory, partition of Ukraine, joining NATO becomes really, really iffy, if not impossible. economic sanctions against Russia. Now, since 2014, Russia has been under economic sanctions, and they've been actually learning to live under sanctions. They're becoming autarkic, self-sufficient economy and a part of the, with regard to Western Europe, the United States. They do have black knights, the one that come to the rescue. China would be one of them, Argentina, Brazil, they're trading really, so they filled in the space that used to be with Europe, with the United States trading. So anyway, that kind of completes my presentation, and thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see some questions.
All right, so before we thank the speaker, Dr. Steinberg, Dr. Gregg, before we open the forum for questions, again, the last call to, there are some food boxes in here, some sandwiches. If you have missed or come later, we still have maybe about 10 boxes remaining, so please do take. If you cannot eat it now, take it for a family member, take it for somebody, a dear one, let's please do take, and also a bottle of water is here. Also, there is an attendance sheet right here. So before leaving, please do not forget to write your name, your A number, and your email, because we have to keep a track on the folks who came attended this talk. So please do so. And then once that is done, we are open to questions. Dr. Steinberg and Dr. Gregg.
Yes, please.
I will unfortunately have to go. I have another meeting before.
First of all, I would like to really thank the speakers, especially for Dr. Steinberg. It was a great presentation. I was really appreciate how he presented the history of the Ukrainian nation. It was
In 10 minutes.
I really like it. So I am Ukrainian. Why I am?
Can we hold it down, folks?
I'm Ukrainian. I'm physics professor at Peay, and I'm Ukrainian, and I know what the evil is Soviet Union. My mother, for example, was actually exiled with her father to Khabarovsk. It is kind of close to Japan. They lived in Taiga and so on. I know all this stuff. And what Dr. Gregg, it's a very professional presentation, but I don't really agree with many things. First of all, why countries wanted to go to NATO? Because the evil, because Soviet Union. They didn't want actually to have anything with evil. And NATO has such a point that if you're in NATO, other countries of NATO will defend. That's the only reason that Poland, actually Hungary, Slovakia, they wanted to this NATO and Ukraine because of evil, because of Soviet Union. That's the first. Other thing is actually there is some things I don't maybe we will discuss, but I really don't agree about this republic kind of this Russian created, orchestrated. After Crimea was annexed, some militia from Crimea, there was some Girkin and there was some other. They came to the Donetsk region and they organized this actually republic. The first prime minister of this Donbas republic was Borodin, who was like a political some kind of speechwriter in Kremlin. He was even not Ukrainian citizen. It was Russian orchestrated, and they repeated what they did already in Moldova, in Pridnestrovia, what they did in Georgia. That they were style. And why they did? Because the NATO, in principle, if you have some problems, territorial problems with other countries, NATO will never accept you. So that's the reason why they did. About this Minsk actually treaties that Ukraine didn't do that. It's not true. Ukraine told safety first. Let's Ukrainian army or some United Nations army take a border, we will take elections. Russians say no. We will take elections only with our parties, without any Ukrainian parties, then we will combine. And they should have this, and they should have the right of veto. So this small part should have a right of veto to go to NATO or to the European Union or to the other things. So that is, again, I want to tell you that, right, there are some tensions in Ukraine. But I believe that in US, there is more tensions than in Ukraine. Yeah, but there is no war. This tension, there is no actually any kind of internal conflict. This conflict was orchestrated by Moscow, and there is actually, it's not the last one. There will be other conflicts one, because as Dr. Steinberg told, because it's not the end. It is not the end. They are actually going further. They will expand. They will go to Ukraine. They will go to Poland. Then they will go to Estonia, where a lot of Russian-speaking people. They will go to Latvia, where a lot of Russian-speaking people. So they will go because it is evil. What I am saying. That is yesterday. If you are talking about any kind of his maybe arguments, yesterday was speech of Putin, and he clearly told. Ukraine is not a nation. They have no any right to be a state. After that, to talk about anything, about some discussions, I don't think so. I'm sorry, maybe I was a little bit too excited, but
Let's see if we can field a couple questions
right.
from some of the students.
Right. Thank you.
I don't know.
How much do you think the energy crisis played a part in coalescing of this event?
Well, energy crisis actually have been, Ukraine have been suffering for a long time because Russia have been selling natural gas to Ukraine, and Ukraine really became dependent on that, and that's when they were trying to really undermine sovereignty. And I'm not pro-Russian by a long shot, so I as an individual, I do agree, absolutely agree that they're flat out wrong. And undermining sovereignty of another sovereign state, essentially opening a can of worms that somebody undermine your sovereignty next time, and putting economic pressure. And right now, it's one of the things that actually, yes, we're all going to be hurting because of the high oil prices for a while, but it will pass. Putin cannot get along without selling oil and gas. He's going to have to find a way to sell it to somebody. So.
The two, I have a question and then, okay. The two places that they moved into are the two that in 2014 and 15, they didn't want in the country. Are they the same? Is that the same?
Donetsk,
So
Luhansk,
why
yeah.
didn't they want them then?
Well, they already occupied Crimea, and they thought it would kind of create outrage from the rest of the world.
Okay.
And I think it's kind of like a bargaining chip. They left it as is.
Until they needed it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I have no idea.
Somebody has a question.
Is there a
Is there a
question?
question from-
What American interests would justify America's involvement with this situation?
What do you mean by involvement? I know you're just reading it.
Yeah.
I have remarked, they signed Budapest Agreement. They actually guaranteed Ukraine that
Yes.
if they will give up nuclear actually,
We would guarantee their
and they
sovereignty.
will be secure. That's it, signed by President Clinton.
Yeah.
Okay?
But Russia is a nuclear state. They're untouchable. So the worst they can do is unless Russia attacks one of the NATO countries, that current NATO countries, because NATO is that kind of alliance, attack on one, considered to be attack on all. And therefore, they're going to find themselves at war in the United States, which they started. And that's the reason, I absolutely agree, that's the reason for Ukraine, it's a salvation, seems like a salvation to join NATO. I don't think United States will allow, no matter strong rhetoric, they're not going to allow Ukraine into NATO as Russia as is right now, unfortunately.
No, I think where the test will come will be over the Baltic states.
Yeah.
Because the Baltic states are a part of NATO. And I have no doubt that sometime in the future, 2 years, 5 years, 6 months, that's where Putin will focus his attention. And so then the question will become, will NATO actually defend the Baltic states? Now, you had your hand.
Yes, sir, Dr.
I
Steinberg.
see you back there too.
My question would be for you directly, based off the history of the region and the things that you discussed, do you think NATO and or the United States response has been appropriate at this point, based off of the history of the area and or action or inaction in the past? If the response by NATO and or the US is appropriate?
Appropriate. You know, I think the real question becomes, what is Ukraine worth to NATO and the United States? We clearly are at a point, I think this has something to do with timing. You correct me if you disagree. But I think we are at a point right now where we are not in a condition politically to start deploying more than a few thousand troops to go to Poland. And if you read that what those troops are going to be used for, if they're used at all, will be to help a flood of refugees, help the Poles sort that out. I don't think that we're in a position to get involved much more beyond that. And I don't think it's worth it. I'm just going to say that right now. It is not worth tangling with a nuclear power and escalating that part of our shield, so to speak.
And the worst part that Kremlin knows that, and that's why they're so bold.
Yeah. Yeah.
So taking all that into account, does the Ukrainian crisis undermine the validity of the European Union because it is on the border of Europe?
Undermine, I don't know about undermine.
Weaken.
Weaken perhaps, but the European Union has had its own issues within its core group. And this predates the pandemic. You know, the Germans reached the point where they said, my God, we're financing everything. And that was causing a fissure of sorts to begin with. You know, I don't want to get into your own personal political proclivities, but what happened in the last administration and the exercise of our foreign policy will go down in the history books as sheer folly and a disaster.
Yeah.
Okay, and in trying to weaken the Western alliance, I think that also emboldens Putin to continue his activities. Undermine, I don't know if they're there yet. Undermine happens when the day comes when I'm hanging out in France and all of a sudden I start seeing French francs again. I'm serious, as opposed to the euro.
Yeah.
And you still hear that. You still hear the longing in France. Where, you know, as soon as we all adopted the euro, we all went into debt. We adopted the euro how many years ago?
2000, the year 2000, they started actually
Yeah.
cashing euros.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
It set the bottom line. It set really bad precedent, and the people and countries feel insecure about that. Yep.
Would you say that self-determination has played a part for these Eastern European countries to the ideation of self-determination has played a part in seeking?
Definitely. The right of people to self-determination. The question is, who do you call the people? Is it this group or that group? Is it Russian-speaking Ukraine, Ukrainian-speaking, the true Ukrainian, the not real, or the? It's really controversial. And if every nation would have a right to have their own state, we would have splinters of very weak, unsustainable economically and militarily.
Tribalism.
Yeah. Yep. Essentially.
And that's been going on since the end of World War I. When
Yeah.
this idea of national self-determination sweeps through Central, Eastern Europe into
And-
the Western border.
And you can thank Woodrow Wilson, who was political scientist, the president.
Wait, I thought he was a historian.
Oh, well, political scientists like to kind of.
I think you called him a pinhead.
I did. He was an academic pinhead.
We have one more question here.
Yeah, there's a question on the.
Oh, yes. It says, do you think the Black Knight countries will stop trading because of this? They are violating UN, cannot acquire land borders through force.
Okay, so
They're violating, cannot acquire land.
yeah, so UN, it's violation of international law. Obviously, Black Knights, they're doing what they're doing because they're benefiting handsomely from it. They're not going to stop doing it. The other thing is that when the giants fight, the third party wins. So China is looking there and they're loving it.
Why do you think Putin decided to wait until the Olympics were over?
Well,
He was watching them.
his friend for life, Xi Jinping, is asking him to do so. Because Putin actually came to the start of the Olympics, the opening ceremony, and proclaimed his undying love for Xi Jinping.
I agree. I think that had a lot to do with it. It's true, he was watching them, but there wasn't going to be an international incident that would take the glory, so to speak, away from China.
And one more, by the way, one more date coming up tomorrow, 23rd of February. It's the Russian national holiday, the defender of the motherland. It's the Russian Army, Red Army Day. It's there. So I guess if I were taking bets, my bet was for tomorrow to be the invasion. I mean, not that I want it. I do not want it. It really prevents, it creates lots of hurdles for me traveling, seeing back my Russian family and those kind of things. And maybe my Visa card that I usually withdraw some Russian rubles from, not going to work there anymore. But I understand why. It's unfortunate.
If there's an all-out invasion, there will be a bloodbath.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians are not just going to roll over.
Oh, yeah.
No, I have a student, are you here? Well, you served in Ukraine. And so, you know, the Ukrainians are not going to roll over. They might lose in the end. They probably will. But I don't think that anybody really wants to watch a bloodbath unfold on CNN and on NPR and so forth.
Okay, we have a question. Yes.
That brings up an interesting question because the Ukrainians are very advanced, even though much smaller. This may be outside the scope. But I don't think Russia's got the heart for a big, long, protracted, full-out take Ukrainian over. Do you see that? Or do you see it just kind of?
I absolutely agree. And that is the part of Putin's yesterday's decision that he recognized the sovereignty of those Donetsk and Luhansk and did not call them Russian provinces, because to come to power takes one set of skills, to hold the power takes completely different set of skills.
You know, I don't think he's interested in a bloodbath. I think yesterday's move was, let's do this, let's see what happens, and let's see if we can't turn down the tension a notch and back off. And he can please his people in Moscow, and we can go away saying, well, we don't like this.
All right, we have one more question at the back. Yeah.
To get away from the conflict slightly and get over to the response, I would agree. Going in, maybe not the move, killing everyone, but looking at how it is gearing up. Conflict creates refugees. We're seeing the European right start to gear up, talk on how refugees are going to flood their countries. What do you think the appropriate response would be from NATO members and from Western Europe, European countries, and do you think they have the political capital or the will to make those decisions?
The response to refugees,
And any other consequences of this continues. But I think refugees can be
yeah, and Europe is stressed right now with refugees, just like we are. And so that'll definitely be a problem. But I also think that they will be accommodated one way or the other. It won't be pretty. Being a refugee is never pretty. Being a refugee means you lose everything except what you can carry. And even then you often lose that. Which is why I was talking about the American mission is going to be to process refugees. And I promise you, the Poles will do everything they can to move those refugees further westward. See if the Germans will take some, see if the French will take
Yes, and Europe is not united. They really kind of struggling to create this European Union identity. It's like still Eastern Europe is there, and they feel quite differently about refugees and taking in the economic immigration from the East.
So I think the key to your bigger question is the Europeans are not all that united. If there is any unity that'll come in policy, it'll begin in Washington. And even that is, I mean, the hypocrisy of our policy, particularly over the past 5 or 6 years, has the Europeans on edge. They don't believe they can count on us. To speak to anybody in France or Germany or Poland.
They can't count on us. I just retired from the army, and I can tell you right now that the war gamers say we cannot go up against a peer or near peer force like Russia or China. In a direct open combat won't last 180 days. And it's not because of bullets or technology or anything, it's because of infrastructure. We can't get water to our troops fast enough.
Yeah.
So we don't want to participate in anything that's going on. And if the region is so unstable, Russia moves in, stabilizes it under their government. They reap the benefit of being part of Russia. They don't have to buy natural gas anymore. They just get it because they're part of Russia. Where's the problem?
What about Poland? What about other countries? If they will go there and stabilize this country, it's okay?
If those
If they will
countries
go
are
to Poland,
already
stabilize Poland, stabilize Czech Republic, stabilize other countries.
from what I'm viewing, is that that country is completely unstable. And the reason it can't get into NATO is because of corruption and political unrest. So, stabilize it. We can't fight them. We're stuck in a box between a rock and a hard place. Our word that we gave them that, yes, we sovereign.
Even better, will be if United States will have an agreement with Putin and sell this country, right? Sell some benefits.
No, what I'm saying is we're stuck between the rock, which is our word that we gave them, saying we would support you, right?
Yeah, you're right.
And the hard places, we would lose.
And
Is
then,
it worth it
then
just
throw
like-
in, something like a 19th century statement like Klaus von Metternich, who taught everybody, a nation has interests. What are our interests? Okay, our interests are not going and suffering another military defeat. How many of those can we suffer before we're just worthless completely? Okay, it's time for us to think about Americans and our future over the next generation.
That is right, but there is no any suggestions that the American troops should go there. So, yeah, we are talking about some kind of other stuff to help from the point of arms and so on, but not go there. So it's not true.
Alex, you have a question.
Yes, over the lectures and over the news I've been reading, I haven't really seen anything saying like talking about national interest, the national interest of the Russian people. Are they interested in doing this?
Well, they're divided. And one of the interesting things is the self-censorship. It's kind of like, you know how it's going to be received, you don't say anything. And so all it takes for evil to happen is for good guys to do nothing. And that's what they're doing, nothing, unfortunately. And it's really, really complicated, but any kind of nation, and I'm going back to my political horse, the political science horse, let's say that, it's only two types of national interest for any nation, wherever you go. It's a security and prosperity, economic. That's down to only two reasons why countries interact with each other. They want to feel less insecure because there is no such a thing as security. There's different degrees of insecurity. You either oblivious, then you feel totally secure, or you're aware. And obviously the resources are limited, so we have to trade.
As I see it, up until this point, Putin has won. He is winning. He starts to lose as soon as the blood starts to flow. Okay, then all of a sudden world opinion will solidify. He's the bad guy. Domestically, Russians will not be happy, just like we're not happy when our sons and our daughters come home maimed or dead from these foreign conflicts. I don't think anybody is really in favor of that. And so, you know, I think as long as he keeps playing the game so that he does what he does and gets away with it, he's winning. As soon as it goes to a hot military situation, he's losing. And nobody understands that better, I suggest, than him.
And it was kind of going back to the China thing. I've heard the theory that it's possible he waited so long because China's getting ready to invade Taiwan as well. They were going to time it.
The theory's out there.
Yeah. Anything is possible. So when everybody preoccupied with the center of the Europe,
It would destabilize the US, so we can't react.
yeah.
Well, we certainly can't react to two global situations. I once taught for the Air Force and they would do these war games. And the only way we won is when the Air Force guys, after they had had enough, they would just all of a sudden create more airplanes. And I'd sit there going, that's how Tsarist Russia conducted war games. You know, and guess what happened to them? We cannot project power to two different regions of the world. We can't do it to one right now.
Yeah, go ahead.
There certainly has been some casualties in the, should we call them the new autonomous republic? But there has been this insurgency going on there since 2014. What I'm talking about when I say spillage of blood is if there's a massive invasion. You start having massive casualty incidents that are overwhelming medical systems. This young lady back there, she's been very patient. Let's give her a shot.
He was talking about the refugees, and we've talked about refugees and so forth. And we heard about the Ukrainians have the identity of love of country. My nephews are Ukrainian. They are in the Ukraine. One's 19 and the other's 24. One has joined the militia and one is not, but he says that if he's recruited to fight for them, he will. They both said they'll die for their country. They were both born in the United States and they were taken back there when they were younger. They've lived back and forth between Poland and so forth. My general feeling is, how many refugees are there really going to be if they have such an identity with their sense of self and country? You know, we've offered them to, you know, we said, hey, you guys, you know, come back to your family, come home. You know, let's get you guys out of that situation. And they're absolutely not. We live, we die for our country. And they know that they have a way out, but, you know, their general population that they, you know, live with, they live in Kiev. And they will not leave, they will stand. And so my question is, you know, is that a general overfeel of the entire country?
I can tell you that, well, I have a very good friend in downtown Krakow right now. And he said that that is absolutely what they're preparing for. I asked him if he was worried if this conflict would spread into Poland. And he said, no, nobody expects that. But they do expect, if there is an invasion, for civilians. And we are talking about non-combatant types wanting to get out. And that is, maybe your nephews are going to stay and fight, but maybe their older relatives who can't fight, who are too old to fight, will want to seek some type of security. Okay, and how widespread is that? I can't answer that. I don't know.
No, political scientists have a very bad track record of predictions. Nobody could predict anything. So it's
We have already 2 weeks kind of such situation. There is no any refugees.
Right.
So there is no
It hasn't started yet.
like actually people start to leave country. No, there is no refugees.
But I don't expect it to start unless there is an all-out invasion.
The good news is he says that life is pretty much, it's not as the news puts it. They said, yes, they're there, but like you said, in 2014, he said said, we have a life, and we're going to have our daily life. Not change our rules.
One more question.
So the entire situation is like it's on the Polish Federation situation has developed in a manner, I would say. And Poland has been on their side. They have a very interesting track record on refugees. Do you think that the nature of the situation is going to lead to them more quickly allowing refugees and pushing them along? Do you think it's going to take a tragedy of the border, or do you think they're going to be more firm, no refugees for a longer time, or very little refugees?
My understanding is that if a refugee flow starts, that the Poles are going to process them and try to move them out of Poland as quickly as possible. If they do not receive support, that is, if they can't move them out, that I think could lead to the type of tragedy that you are envisioning. That is, they'll reach a saturation point, they'll have to close the border. And that's when things get, well, dicey.
Yeah, we can only hypothesize, and if refugees will reach Germany. I have a best friend from high school living in Germany, and she says that very hostile attitudes towards refugees there. I mean, in general, kind of, at least in the big cities like Leipzig, she lives in.
All right, any other questions? We are like about 30 minutes past 4 o'clock, so if, thank you for coming, and there's a couple of water bottles still there, if you want the water, the water.
Did you give away all the food?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Clean out the park.
Sure, I'll clean it up. Sure.